Hi, I'm Hatim Kheir, counsel for the Justice Center of Constitutional Freedoms, with your update for Day 29 of the Public Order Emergency Commission hearings. A lot of exciting stuff today. We heard from three federal ministers. We heard from David Lametti, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General for Canada. We heard from Anita Anand, the Minister for the Department of Defense, and we heard from Omar Alghabra, the Minister of Transportation. So I'll start with Minister Lametti. So again, he's the Attorney General for Canada and Minister of Justice, so we talked a bit about how those are two different roles that he has to balance. But then things got interesting when Commission Counsel started asking him about text messages that suggest that the Emergencies Act was considered very early on in the protests. Within the second or third day of the protest being in Ottawa, there's a text message from Minister Lametti talking about considering the Emergencies Act. There was also a text message shortly after that was sent to Minister Lametti about a meeting where, quote, Angle is incoming the Emergencies Act, end quote. And so he explained that was part of preparatory work. He was also questioned about Parliament's choice, I believe this was by the Canadian Constitution Foundation, about Parliament's choice to reference the CSIS decision in its formation of the Emergencies Act. It was Commission Counsel, because Minister Lametti answered that the decision is with Cabinet, not CSIS, and so Commission Counsel pushed back and called that a straw man argument and asked if he'd actually heard anyone argue that. So Minister Lametti then went back to this idea that we've heard from a bit, that the structure of the Emergencies Act suggests a broader area of interpretation. Then, under cross-examination by Alan Honor for the Democracy Fund, he was shown a text message supporting the revocation of the act because the NDP and the Senate weren't going to support it, which goes to suggest that that was more of a political decision than one in response to the actual situation. Turning over to Minister Anand, who is the Minister of Defense, so the bulk of her testimony related to the potential of the Canadian Armed Forces assisting and dealing with the protests. She said that they didn't want to do that because they were concerned about deploying Army tow trucks, that it might lead to an escalation, and that soldiers aren't trained in crowd control or protest management. By the Counsel for the Government of Alberta, she was cross-examined on how that assessment was impacted by a plan that would have removed the protesters first, then just had military tow trucks come and remove the trucks later. And she said that that wouldn't change because she was concerned about the visual of deploying the Canadian Armed Forces. She also referred to the National Defense Act as a last resort. My colleague Rob Kittredge cross-examined her on that point and pressed her because the Emergencies Act actually says that it can only be invoked if the problem can't be dealt with by any other laws of Canada. The National Defense Act allows the military to be deployed if the situation can't be resolved without the help of the armed forces. And when pressed on the fact that the National Defense Act is a law of Canada, Minister Anand essentially wouldn't answer the question, emphasizing that, in her words, these were two different things. She kept referring to the Emergencies Act as being about legal instrument, whereas the National Defense Act were about methods. But then when pressed on that point, it is a law of Canada, she refused to answer the question. She was also pressed on the point of Cabinet solidarity by Mr. Kittredge, and taken to the idea that Cabinet solidarity, which is this quasi-constitutional principle that says that Cabinet ministers have to basically in private, they can debate amongst themselves. Their debate is kept confidential. And then in public, they have to put together or they have to put forward a unified front, and they have to stand behind the decisions of Cabinet. Mr. Kittredge cross-examined her, saying that she has to defend the Emergencies Act because of Cabinet solidarity, and that essentially she would have to resign if she disagreed. And she refused to answer the question, claiming that it was hypothetical and irrelevant. Lastly, we heard from Minister Omar Alghabra, who's the Minister of Transportation. One very interesting point that came out in his testimony was a document from one of the, I believe it was an IRG meeting, which is the Incident Response Group, which was put together to respond to the protests. The federal government offered assistance to other provinces to buy tow trucks like Alberta was doing, and the other provinces refused and showed no interest. He was also asked by me about the role of the federal government's vaccine mandate in causing the protests to begin with. And specifically, we've seen at least 4 different provinces accelerated their plan to drop COVID restrictions while the protests were going on. I challenged him that this must be evidence that they were doing it in response to the protests. He didn't agree and insisted that the government doesn't. I want to be fair to him, but basically that the government doesn't listen to protesters. It makes its decisions based on science. I think tellingly, he said that the sentiment of Canadians and the interests of Canadians are sometimes 2 different things. And then I pressed him on the idea that basically the government could have dropped this mandate, but boxed themselves out of doing that by calling the protesters white supremacists. Then the second point I took him to was the role of the emergency measures orders in compelling tow truck drivers to provide services to the government. In his own words, he agreed that some of the tow truck drivers refused to tow trucks because they agreed with the protest. And so I asked him that forcing tow truck drivers to tow trucks regardless of their beliefs would actually be an infringement of their charter rights. And his answer to that was that he didn't implement the rules and he'd hope that they would be used against tow truck drivers who wanted to help, which begs the question why they were needed in the first place. That was the evidence from today. We have 2 more exciting days as we hear from individuals from the Prime Minister's office, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, and the Prime Minister himself, Justin Trudeau. So tune in tomorrow for the next exciting day of these hearings. Thanks, and I'll talk to you then.